Ryomen Sukuna, the King of Curses. He is the main antagonist in the Jujutsu Kaisen series, and his unending pool of strength comes from his 20 fingers. What if a Sukuna with only 15 of his fingers were to go against the combatants of the Sendai Colony, those being Dhruv, Kurourushi, Uro, and Ryu? Sukuna is pretty powerful, however, the sorcerers in Sendai are absolutely no joke, and have a quite fearsome and wide range of abilities. Let's start off with Dhruv. Dhruv is introduced as a veteran and has two types of Shikigami. Their orbiting trajectories constitute Dhruv's domain. We see many Rikas fly around Uro when Yuta uses Dhruv's technique with copy, and the Shikigami create their own domain. As soon as Uro walks into this domain, she immediately gets cut. We see this again in chapter 250 in the Sukuna fight when Yuta launches these mini Rikas at Sukuna. The Rikas create a barrier around Sukuna, and when Sukuna is baited into walking into these barriers, he gets cut, as he states this himself. Unfortunately, this is kind of all we get from Dhruv, and it's not even really him, it's mostly Yuta using his technique. But we have way more information on the other people in Sendai, like for example the next person I'm going to be talking about, who is Kurourushi. Kurourushi is different from everyone else that we're going to be talking about today because he is a cursed spirit, and he utilizes cockroaches in combat. We see in chapter 174 when he first shows up that he can break down random civilians with his wave of cockroaches. He also has a blade called the Festering Life Sword, which is stated to mix life and death. Being a cockroach, Kurourushi can naturally fly, and we also see that he can use the cockroaches that he manipulates as some sort of armor when Yuta attempts to strike him with a sword, and Kurourushi sort of blocks the strike and negates most of the damage. Kurourushi also has an ability called Earthen Insect Trance, which seems to spawn in two, other bugs, and they sort of swirl around Yuta and bring forth a multitude of cockroaches. Using his sword, Kurourushi can also spawn other cockroaches inside of Yuta, which Yuta makes quick work of, but it clearly seems like a problem, as this forces Yuta to use RCT, which his original intention was to not do, as to not warn Uro and Ryu that he had it. The next, and I would say second strongest combatant in Sendai is Uro. Uro's entrance to the fight, at least in the manga, was kinda cool because she appears by whispering in Yuta's ear and kinda catching him off guard, as Yuta just finished off Kurourushi. Uro's curse technique is kinda cool. She can manipulate the sky, and the sky acts as sort of a surface to her, which she can grab and move at will. We see that she's able to bend Yuta's arm with it, but it doesn't actually hurt or permanently change the shape of Yuta's arm. Yuta then comes to the conclusion that Uro's curse technique probably controls space, but it doesn't actually crush her opponent. Uro later explains that she doesn't hit the person with her technique, but she hits the surface of the sky, and as she breaks that surface like thin ice, she then breaks or hits her opponent along with it. We see that Uro is able to take a Ryu's beam and throw it right back at him, and essentially just completely deflect his attack. Based on their first interaction, we see that Uro is 100% able to keep up with Yuta in terms of overall speed, at least in a close quarters sense. We see again much later in the fight after Yuta fully summons Rika that Uro is again able to keep up with Yuta and block his strike. But perhaps the biggest difference between Uro and Kurourushi and Dhruv is that Uro has a domain expansion. We don't exactly see her domain, but just the fact that she had one already puts her on a certain level and keeps her up to a certain bar of sorcery. A domain expansion can be a make or break in terms of a fight. Speaking of domain expansion, this leads nicely into the final combatant in Sendai that I'll be covering, that being Ryu, as Ryu was the third combatant in Uro, Ryu, and Yuta's domain clash. Ryu's entrance was perhaps even more cool and surprising than Uro's, as he entered by disturbing a scene between Uro and Yuta by firing off a massive granite blast. Ryu's technique is pretty vague, so I'm not going to go into it as it's kind of unclear as to what exactly it is, and I've talked to many people about it and we couldn't really come to any sort of conclusion. Even external to his natural born curse technique, there's a lot to cover about Ryu, like for example his granite blast. His granite blast can be utilized in different ways. He can fire off a massive one like how he did when he first entered, or right after when he fires off multiple little granite blasts. It's stated right after their domain clash that Ryu is the only sorcerer capable of releasing the same amount of power regardless of whether he's activated his curse technique or not. Ryu's physical strength and durability is also off the charts. We see that in terms of his physical strength, it's stated that a single blow was too much for Rika even when she was completely manifested. In terms of his durability, he's able to take a thin icebreaker to the chest and a head strike from Rika. And remember, prior in the same fight, Ryu is also able to take his own granite blast when Uro redirects it at him. Bear in mind that this was the same granite blast that was able to completely destroy and annihilate Uro. However, it is completely fair to say that Uro was weakened considering that she had just used a domain expansion and had been fighting for a considerable amount of time. However, this is still an impressive feat for Ryu nonetheless. It's also stated that even at full power, Yuta's blasts with Rika are still weaker than Ryu's. In terms of physical stats, Ryu is clearly able to keep up with Yuta, and having the highest output out of any combatant in the Culling games at the time, Ryu probably just has higher overall physical stats than anyone, considering that output is probably the highest contributing factor to your stats in Jujutsu Kaisen. Well, looks like this is going to be a pretty tough fight for Sukuna. He has to deal with 4 high level and skilled combatants, 2 of them having a domain expansion, and all 4 of them generally having powerful and useful abilities in a fight against pretty much anyone. However, what you'll come to realize soon is that absolutely none of this matters. 15 Finger Sukuna would absolutely mop everyone in Sendai in a fight. First off, let's dive deeper into what exactly Sukuna's abilities are. He has 2 types of slashing attacks, Dismantle and Cleave. Dismantle is his main slashing attack, whereas Cleave is his secondary one, and can be adjusted depending on the target's toughness and cursed energy level to cut them down in one fell swoop. Dismantle is the typical long-range slash that you'll see Sukuna use, like for example when he used it on Mahoraga and against Maki, and Cleave is the short-range slash where Sukuna has to actually make physical contact with the person that he wants to use Cleave on. Typically when he uses Cleave, the person will be turned into blocks or like cubes, as you see when Sukuna uses Cleave on the girl with the iPhone or whatever phone in Shibuya. Sukuna, similarly to Ryu, is absolutely no lackey when it comes to raw physical strength. We see that when he takes over Megumi's body in the Culling games, he's able to punch Maki in the face and have her spit out blood. This is a pretty impressive feat considering that Maki is a fighter that solely relies on her physicals and has tuned them to the highest level after becoming fully realized. Let's not forget to mention that Maki is also the same person who is able to take black flashes from Sukuna in Shinjuku. Granted that Sukuna is weakened, however, this is still an extremely impressive feat. Battle IQ and just general intelligence is also something that I feel like isn't quite talked about enough when it comes to power scaling, especially in reference to JJK, and there are many cases where having better battle IQ or just general IQ overall in comparison to your opponent has led to victory. For example, Gojo vs Sukuna. Speaking of Gojo vs Sukuna, based on this fight, we can very easily come to the conclusion that Sukuna has extremely high battle IQ. He was able to outsmart Gojo, who is generally considered very smart, and via outsmarting him, he was able to beat him in the end by having Mahoraga create the formula for the world-cutting slash. He also took advantage of Gojo using the very simple principle to off-guard your opponent when they are assured of victory. After Gojo landed the purple on Sukuna, he thought that he had for sure won the fight, and Sukuna took advantage of this opportunity to off-guard Gojo and cut him in half. I could go on and on all day about how smart Sukuna is, but I think this is already enough to show that he's very capable of coming up with strategic plans in combat. I'm not really gonna go over Fuga, seeing as how I don't think it would really be a factor in this fight, and as I'll explain later, I don't think the fight will ever get to a point where Sukuna would even consider using Fuga. However, one very important thing that I have yet to cover is Sukuna's domain. Sukuna's domain is an open barrier technique that trumps other domains that have a barrier. We see this very explicitly in Sukuna vs Gojo, when Sukuna's open barrier domain attacks Gojo's from the outside where all domains are naturally weak. Based on the fact that Sukuna has an open barrier domain, we can come to two very important conclusions. One being that Sukuna is more skilled than Uro and Ryu, because even though they also have domains, it's implied that having an open barrier domain is by far more skillful, since it's described as a truly divine technique and it's akin to an artist painting on air rather than painting on a canvas. Right before Gojo and Sukuna have their first domain clash in Shinjuku, all the spectators of the fight, including people like Kusakabe and Maki, are conversing about how crazy and impossible it is for someone like Sukuna to have an open barrier domain. Kusakabe demonstrates the craziness of this by asking Miwa to toss him some water, but when Miwa tosses him a bottle of water, Kusakabe says that he didn't ask for a bottle of water, he simply asked for Miwa to toss him some water. This is obviously impossible. Miwa can't literally physically pick up the water in the bottle and toss it to him as if she was tossing him a regular bottle of water. However, this was simply to demonstrate how crazy it is for Sukuna to have an open barrier technique. So via all of these implications and statements, we can very easily come to the conclusion that an open barrier domain is superior to a closed barrier domain. We can also come to the conclusion that Sukuna would beat Ryu and Uro in a domain clash. Them having a domain is meaningless if it would simply fall apart to Sukuna's divine technique. One thing I have yet to touch on is speed, and for good reason, because if I had talked about speed first, this whole matchup thing would be completely irrelevant and boring. Ryu is bare minimum relative to Yuta in terms of raw speed, and Yuta is bare minimum relative to Uro and also significantly above Kurourushi and Dhruv in terms of speed. This means that Sukuna completely outscales everyone in Sendai in terms of speed. The reason for this is that in chapter 216, we see that 16-finger Maguna, who should be relative or equal to 15-finger in terms of speed, absolutely blitzes and outspeeds Ryu when he fights him. This means that realistically, all Sukuna would need to do when he appears in Sendai and gets swapped out with Yuta is walk around and speed blitz Dhruv, then speed blitz Kurourushi, speed blitz Uro, and then speed blitz Ryu, because Ryu scales above everyone in Sendai in terms of speed. Not to mention that even if all four of them jumped him at the exact same time and they worked together, Sukuna, instead of outspeeding them, could also just pop his domain, which would easily kill everyone there. We see that with just basic slashes, he's able to damage Ryu in chapter 216, even while holding back and underestimating him. This matchup could potentially get even worse depending on what version of 15-finger Sukuna you want to use. The purpose of this video was to have Sukuna in Yuji's body go against Sendai. However, if you take Sukuna in Megami's body, obviously removing his 10% output nerf that he had, then he would be able to utilize the 10 Shadows technique, so he can summon Divine Dogs or even straight up Mahoraga if he felt like it, and Mahoraga, based off his scaling in Shinjuku, would likely also beat everyone in Sendai even by himself, at least in a one-on-one. But yeah, anyways guys, I think I've gone over pretty much everything that I wanted to explain why Sukuna slams Sendai and everyone in it. This is my first YouTube video, so any support would be appreciated, and yeah, this is Static. Peace out.